Major funding for the series, Louisiana, A History, was provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and the State of Louisiana. Corporate funding was provided by Bank One, proud to celebrate Louisiana's diverse past and committed to investing in our state's future. Community Coffee, part of Louisiana's rich history. Since 1919, devoted to providing signature coffees to our communities. Additional funding was provided by the following history patrons, helping all citizens discover the extraordinary legacy of Louisiana and its people.
I have the pleasure to inform you that on this day, the island of New Orleans and province of Louisiana were amicably surrendered to the commissioners of the United States.
Louisianians struggled with their new identity. Now they were Americans.
They had been subjects of a monarchy. They had no real experience with the democratic process. They spoke different languages.
Their ways of life confounded their new countrymen.
When the Americans came to Louisiana and to New Orleans, one of the things that startled them was the tremendous amount of latitude that free blacks enjoyed. They were not prepared for that.
But Louisiana would prove itself on the field of battle.
They fought like desperados and deserved distinguished praise.
And in the fields of sugarcane and cotton, where the labor of slaves created incredible wealth.
New Orleans in the first half of the century was above all a boom town.
I don't think it was so wonderful. I really don't. They left a rich legacy of architecture, but they also were major players in America's greatest ugliness, and that was slavery.
At the height of a prosperity based on the enslavement of others, Louisiana would be forced to choose between allegiance to the United States or secession. Her choice would cost her people more than they could have imagined.
After generations as a European colony, Louisiana joined the young American nation at the turn of the 19th century. And less than 60 years later, she would tear herself away from it again. In those intervening years, however, political, economic, and cultural forces combined to begin the long process of Americanizing Louisiana, a process that, some feel, continues to this day.
At the dawn of the new century, a young American sailed down the Mississippi River and took command of the vast territory known as Louisiana. His name was William Charles Cole Claiborne. Along with General James Wilkinson and a small American army, Claiborne hoisted an American flag over New Orleans, and on December 20th, 1803, Louisiana was joined to the United States, forever changing both. William C.C. Claiborne was only in his 20s when he became governor of the Louisiana Territory, an area larger than the entire United States at that time. 3/4 of the population and nearly all of the wealth were concentrated in lower Louisiana near the mouth of the Mississippi. The Americans soon discovered that even more formidable than the sheer size of Louisiana was the diversity of its people.
Acquiring Louisiana raised significant challenges politically, religiously, culturally for the Americans. The native population of Louisiana viewed the Americans with a great deal of suspicion. The Americans viewed the native Louisianians with a great deal of suspicion.
Congress divided this region from the rest of the Purchase and assigned it to Governor Claiborne. The territory of Orleans, as it was called, encompassed most of the present state of Louisiana, except Baton Rouge and the Florida parishes. New Orleans was the largest city in the antebellum South and one of the leading ports of the continent. It was a bustling frontier community of more than 10,000. To the Americans, these people seemed utterly alien. At first glance, young Claiborne seemed ill-prepared for the enormous job of ruling a foreign people.
He came to govern the colony without being able to speak French, and in some ways, I think in some ways was perplexed by some of the customs of the society that he found himself the master of.
A shrewd statesman, Governor Claiborne quickly learned to play the game of Louisiana politics. Of course, at times, even he found it difficult to embrace these strange Creoles.
To bring these folks to their senses, we'll have to aim cannons at them and knock down the walls of the city from top to bottom.
Some Creoles came to see New Orleans as a city under enemy occupation.
A few of the French officers and citizens are mortified at the loss of this delightful country and seem to foster great hatred to the Americans. It requires much address and prudence to preserve the harmony of the city.
They despised the American as being uncouth. They knew they would not be able to absorb the Americans the way they had absorbed the Spanish, that their culture would be swamped. And they were right.
Americans pour in daily, not in families, but in large bodies. The leading gentlemen, when not talking of tobacco and cotton, find it very amusing to abuse and ridicule French morals, French manners, and French houses.
Even the public ballroom, where Creoles and Americans came together for entertainment, degenerated into what Claiborne called a theater of disorder.
A fracas originated in a contest between some young Americans and Frenchmen.
30 Americans and Frenchmen scuffled with each other. It was an infernal melee.
But drunken brawls weren't the only threat that required Governor Claiborne's vigilance. Long after Governor Claiborne assumed control, Spanish troops lingered in Louisiana, raising the American suspicions.
Spain had been careful enough to get Louisiana to use it as a buffer to keep the Americans away from the silver mines of Mexico. It makes a lot of sense that the Spanish did not want to see this buffer state surrendered.
With Texas to the west and Florida to the east, Louisiana was surrounded by Spanish territory. Rumors of conspiracy spread throughout Louisiana like a summer fever. Tensions ran high. Then in 1810, the first shots of a small revolution were fired.
I yesterday returned from St. Francisville, a little town in the Spanish territory, where I found the whole country in a state of rebellion.
Anglo-Americans had been pouring into Baton Rouge and lands east of the Mississippi, all part of Spanish Florida at that time. On September 23rd, Philemon Thomas led a small force of Americans from St. Francisville.
They marched on Baton Rouge, overthrew the Spanish fort, which was not difficult to do. Like you can visualize, it was sort of a sleepy place. I think one person was killed and 2 wounded. But they then established the Republic of West Florida.
These so-called Florida parishes declared their independence from Spain and raised a flag over Baton Rouge bearing a lone star.
And suddenly, these now independent parishes join with the part of Louisiana that was bought in the purchase and become part of the state of Louisiana in 1812.
In time, treaties would establish Louisiana's present borders at the Pearl River in the east and at the Sabine in the west. But even more than the threats from outside, it was the growing storm within her borders that would prove most ruinous to Louisiana.
The flourishing situation of the country enables the people to buy slaves very fast. Here you will ask, what do they want with so many Negroes? The answer is to make more money. Again you will ask, what do they want with so much money? The answer is to buy more Negroes.
Since its founding more than a century before, Louisiana's survival had depended on slavery. But now, under American rule, the region's plantation economy was beginning to change and grow, and the demand for slaves grew with it. Cotton became king in Louisiana first, almost before any other place in the antebellum South. That's because the first working cotton gin in the entire Mississippi Valley was built by two Louisianians in 1795. Following a newspaper description of Eli Whitney's machine, a Baton Rouge area planter, Daniel Clark, and a master mechanic, John Barclay, transformed the region's cotton industry. John Barclay was a slave.
Soon, Daniel Clark's cotton gins were operating up and down the river, and by the time Eli Whitney's cotton revolution had occurred on the Atlantic coast, cotton was already galvanizing a new economic prosperity for Louisiana.
With the coming of the cotton gin, Louisiana's fields were soon blanketed in white. Anglo-American planters flocked to the territory of Orleans, hoping to get rich.
These individuals were simply businessmen. They came to make a profit in cotton production, and they came and found themselves able to acquire land in one of the richest river deltas in the world. And what they did was expand that production of cotton as rapidly as possible, and they pushed the slave workforce.
More and more slaves were needed to plant, pick, and process the cotton. But if cotton was king, there was a rival to the throne: sugar.
Sugar had been grown in Louisiana since colonial times. Prior to the 1790s, however, there was no good process for refining sugar. In 1795, Etienne Boré, a sugar planter at New Orleans who would later be mayor of the city, perfected a good process for refining sugar. Sugar became a major cash crop along the lower Mississippi Valley, as Louisiana soon emerged as a major sugar producer for the United States.
Later, sugar production would be further revolutionized by inventor Norbert Reyer. Just as the cotton gin had expanded cotton production, Reyer's more efficient vacuum pan processing would increase the demand for sugar and slaves. It was a bitter irony for a man who was himself a descendant of slaves. Sugar and cotton transformed Louisiana and the institution of slavery. Vast plantations sprang up along the river. Some were manned by as many as 1,000 slaves. Agriculture was assuming the spirit of the industrial age. Like the factories of the North, profitable plantations operated as well-oiled machines, with human beings functioning as little more than parts to be worn out and replaced.
The great factories were, in the beginning of the 19th century, were not indoors. They were on southern cotton and sugar plantations. They were factories in the fields.
what they usually did was found out what would be your maximum weight for an average state. So, for example, if you could pick 300 pounds of cotton, they expected 300 pounds every day. If you came in under, you'd be beaten. If you had a very good day and you brought in more, that became your new quota.
They used to whip slaves if they didn't pick enough cotton. They were stripped of all clothing and whipped with rawhide. Then they'd be put back to picking cotton with all that suffering.
The only thing that exceeded the demand for slaves was the desire for profit. Within a few years of the purchase, the slave population surged to over 35,000. More than half of all Louisianians were in bondage. With the purchase, American ideals of liberty had come to Louisiana, but not to Louisiana's slaves. In colonial times, Louisiana's slaves were governed by the Code Noir, the Black Code, which guaranteed them certain limited rights. But those rights were abolished by the Americans.
Discipline was given almost wholly to the masses under the American legal code. They no longer would recognize slave marriages. Husband could be sold apart from his wife. Children could be sold apart from their families. Slaves owned property. That would change under the Americans.
In an uneasy compromise with Northern lawmakers, Congress banned the importation of slaves to the United States in 1808. However, that didn't stop slaves from being traded within the United States. And many hundreds more were smuggled into Louisiana by bands of pirates, like Jean Lafitte.
The great numbers daily imported is alarming to the thinking part of the people. I am fearful that unless a stop is soon put to the increasing of the number, that day is fast approaching when whites will fall a sacrifice to the blacks.
That day came on January 8th, 1811. The uprising made news around the world and shook the foundations of slavery at home in Louisiana.
The largest slave rebellion that took place within the territorial limits of the United States was in fact led and organized by an immigrant, if you will, a black man who had been a slave on the island of Saint-Domingue, who was a driver on a plantation there in St. Charles Parish.
To the planters, they were brigands and bandits, but to their fellow slaves, Charles Deslandes and his followers were revolutionaries. Soon their ranks grew to as many as 500, according to some estimates. The rebels' objective was to travel River Road and attack New Orleans. According to one of the slaves, once in the city, their goal was simply détruire les blancs. That is, to kill the whites. Less than a day's journey from their target, they were halted at Destrehan Plantation.
We have been so happy as to meet the brigands. Their colors displayed in full arrogance, we rushed upon their troops, of whom we made considerable slaughter.
Well armed, the planters' militia was joined by federal troops and artillery. Soon the fields and marshes were littered with the corpses of slaves. When the revolt was over, 2 whites had been killed. According to official records, 66 slaves lost their lives. Patrols later discovered many more bodies.
Those that were thought to be leaders of the uprising, or those that had committed any major crime, they were summarily tried at Destrehan Plantation. They were executed, their heads were cut off and put on stakes along the Mississippi River to remind other slaves of the consequences of rebellion.
All over the country, within a matter of months, people were talking about this rebellion in Louisiana. Now, for those persons who were anti-slavery, say this is a warning. If you don't watch out, your slaves are going to rise up in rebellion. They're going to cut your throats. To those people, of course, who believe that slavery is very profitable, the solution was that it had to be made more secure.
Unless there's order and subordination kept up amongst the Negroes, they would soon be masters instead of slaves. For though they are black, they have as great a propensity to command and be tyrants as white people generally have.
Creoles and Anglos had disagreed on many things in the past, but it was clear now that they shared a stake in the growing plantation economy and in slavery.
What kind of government would at first be most suitable and proper? God only knows. The principles of a popular government are utterly beyond their comprehension.
In November 1811, 43 leading Louisianians came together at a coffee house in New Orleans. Half of them were Creole and half were Anglo-American. Julian Poydras, a plantation owner from Pointe-Coupée, was elected president of their convention. Together they worked to forge a constitution for Louisiana's new government. At last, she was ready to become one of the United States. On April 30th of 1812, Congress approved the Constitution. The territory of Orleans and the Florida parishes were joined and renamed Louisiana. It became the 18th state in the Union. The aristocrats who wrote Louisiana's Constitution gave sweeping powers to the governor, but few to the people. Only adult white males owning considerable property could vote for their leaders. This disqualified 2/3 of the state's white men in 1812, and all non-whites and women. Hard-fought compromises gave Louisiana a body of laws which mirror her diverse cultural heritage. English and American traditions of criminal justice, like trial by jury, combined with elements of the French Napoleonic Code, as well as Spanish and Roman civil law. And now, for the first time in her history, Louisiana was free to choose her own governor. She chose William C.C. Claiborne. After years of struggle, he finally managed to win the loyalty of the people of Louisiana. But soon their loyalty would be tested on the battlefield.
The news of the morning leaves us no hope of peace, and every reason to believe that Louisiana will soon be attacked by the enemy.
The United States had gone to war with England in 1812, shortly after Louisiana became a state. Within 2 years, Washington, D.C. had been invaded and burned to the ground by British troops. New Orleans knew that she might soon face the same fate.
Louisiana's strategic importance in the War of 1812 depended almost solely on the significance of the Mississippi River. Control of the Mississippi in a time when water power was the most popular form of transportation in the South and in the interior of America was essentially to control the commerce and defense of the continent. So Louisiana was of utmost strategic importance.
General Andrew Jackson, known as Old Hickory, was dispatched to New Orleans, commanding an army of seasoned riflemen from Tennessee and Kentucky. Once there, they prepared to meet one of England's most formidable generals, Sir Edward Pakenham. But it wasn't just the approaching British army that concerned Old Hickory.
When Jackson first came to Louisiana. When he first came to New Orleans, he was worried that many of the Louisianians would turn against them and side with the British, and that would ultimately lead to defeat on the part of the Americans. It was a concern he probably should not have had. If the French in New Orleans didn't like the Americans, they hated the English more.
Instead of treachery, Jackson found his ranks growing with volunteers from the Louisiana militia. Acadians and Indians, Creoles and free people of color, all stepped forward to defend the young state. General Jackson even managed to secure the loyalties of Jean Lafitte and his small army of pirates, the Baratarians. Lafitte was one of America's most wanted criminals. But in the face of invasion, all differences were put aside and a pardon was promised.
This was the turning point of my career and the best moment of my life when I decided once and for all to drive the English beasts from American soil.
After weeks of skirmishes, the main force of General Pakenham's army advanced toward New Orleans. Amidst thick fog on the morning of January 8, 1815, American troops engaged the enemy on the Chalmette plantation. British forces in the Louisiana campaign had totaled 14,000. The American army numbered only 5,000. Jackson's prospects for victory looked grim. All through the night before, nuns, laywomen, and children knelt in the Ursuline convent praying for a miracle. They got it. British casualties were staggering. 2,037 killed, wounded, and captured. Jackson tallied the number of his men killed at 7. What no one realized was that a peace treaty between the British and the Americans had been signed on Christmas Eve, 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans. Word did not reach the generals in time. The War of 1812 proved to the world that the United States was an independent nation with the power to defend itself. But the people of Louisiana had proved something too.
These are the saviors of their country. These the patriot soldiers who triumphed over the invincibles of Wellington and conquered the conquerors of Europe. You have secured to America a proud name among the nations of the earth, a glory which will never perish.
Diverse as they were, Louisianians of all kinds had come together as a united people to defend their homeland. But perhaps what surprised the Americans most was the number of free people of color who volunteered. 2 black battalions, over 600 men, served in the Battle of New Orleans. Black soldiers and white soldiers fighting alongside each other. This was something not seen elsewhere in America. From the first day when the United States flag was raised in New Orleans, free people of color presented a troubling question for the Americans.
What Claiborne and Wilkinson commented on at that ceremony as they stood on the porch of the Cabildo looking out at the assembled people of New Orleans was the fact that there were all these militia units present to watch and participate in this moment of imperial transfer. And among the militia were free men of color. And these Anglo-Americans, old Virginian and this old general, were absolutely horrified. And there are not only free people of color, but there are armed free people of color, armed mulattoes. And they're just They're just terrified.
When the Americans came to Louisiana and to New Orleans, one of the things that startled them was the tremendous amount of latitude that free blacks enjoyed. They were not prepared for that.
To most Americans, whites were free, blacks were slaves, and there was little room for anything in between. But Louisiana's gens de couleur libre, free people of color, didn't fit those categories. For a time, at the start of the 19th century, every other black person in New Orleans was free. The majority were French-speaking Louisianians called Creoles of color. Their heritage was a blending of French, Spanish, Indian, and African ancestry. Among Creoles, the lines between white and black were often blurred by family ties.
There's evidence that there was a lot of mixing between the races and the classes in New Orleans. I mean, there were families that had white members who were free people of color, and members who were slaves. Those people were tied together in families, and they recognized that. And they honored that. They honored their obligations to one another. It wasn't perfect. There were atrocities committed nonetheless.
Marriages between whites and blacks were prohibited, and it was against the law for a white man to have sexual relations with black women. Naturally, this law was continually ignored. Creole society permitted a white man to take a woman of color as his mistress. Free women of color would attend special masquerade balls where they could meet and socialize with white men of means.
If they found the appropriate white man, their mother would strike an arrangement, a plaçage type arrangement, in which the man would provide the woman with a home and subsequently educate their children and provide for them some amount of money for them over their lifetimes.
The beauty of this ballroom far exceeds anything of the sort we have at the North. There were about 40 women present of all shades, from the very dark mulatto to the light quadroon. Nearly all had masks, white masks.
But as Americanization continued, Louisiana grew to resemble other southern states more and more. Racial ambiguities among the Creoles and the great number of free people of color made the Americans increasingly uncomfortable.
When the free people of color, the Creoles, were noticed, they were seen as an economic threat because they owned property and they had acquired quite a bit of money and they had skills and education. So they were seen as a threat to the Americans.
Despite growing intolerance, Louisiana's free people of color made important and overlooked contributions to our history. And some of them grew to be very wealthy. In the Cane River area of Natchitoches Parish, French planter Claude Matoyer and his slave Marie-Thérèse Coincoin parented a large family. Once freed, Marie managed to liberate all her children, and they inherited large tracts of land, becoming plantation owners themselves.
Louis Matoyer became very successful. I think by the time he died, he was one of the largest planters, black or whites, in Natchitoches Parish.
His brother, Augustin, provided the money to build a Catholic church, the first to serve a congregation of free people of color in North America.
But what is interesting, though, was they lived sort of a marginal life, because legally they were free blacks. They were not free in the sense that whites were. They didn't have all the same privileges. Socially, obviously, they didn't have the same privileges that whites had. But on an economic level, they were probably better off than most whites.
Just like wealthy whites, some free people of color owned slave laborers and profited from the plantation economy. But more often, slaves were purchased by their own relatives so that families could be reunited.
There were not only the pure old Indian Americans, and the Spanish, French, English, Celtic, and African, but nearly all possible mixed varieties of these, and no doubt of some other breeds of mankind.
New Orleans had grown to be America's leading port after New York. Ships from every region of the globe plied the muddy waters that flowed through the city, picking up cargo and dropping off people. Between 1840 and 1860, over 500,000 immigrants crossed the docks of New Orleans. There were shopkeepers from Spain, fruit merchants from Sicily, and beer brewers from Germany. Throughout the 19th century, waves of German immigrants arrived in the port of New Orleans. Along with their love of music and theater, many brought valuable skills with them from the old country. By 1860, almost half the population of the city had been born in another country, bringing to New Orleans people like philanthropist Judah Thoreau, the Dutch Jew who founded Thoreau Infirmary. In fact, Jews from all over the world came to New Orleans, and soon the city claimed the largest Jewish population in the South, numbering over 8,000. There was architect James Gallier, a native of Ireland, who gave us some of New Orleans' most recognizable landmarks. By far, the largest immigrant population was Irish. In the wake of the potato famine, tens of thousands of refugees came, most of them poor. But when they arrived in New Orleans, many faced even worse hardships than what they had left behind.
In Louisiana, a white person could not be a slave legally, but there were some persons who were white in some instances were treated worse than slaves. For example, when Irish immigrants began coming here, they were hired for jobs that you would not allow your slaves to do. So for example, if you did not want your slave to get injured digging a canal, because that would be a loss to you, they might hire Irishmen. In fact, we just found out that there were thousands of Irishmen who lost their lives digging canals.
Nobody knows how many Irish laborers died building the New Basin Canal. Estimates of the numbers of bodies buried there range into the tens of thousands.
The levee was covered with boxes, bales, bags, hogsheads, pipes, barrels, kegs of goods, wares, and merchandise from all ends of the earth.
New Orleans in the first half of the century was above all a boom town. It was a place where you went to get rich. And other than that, the rules were few, and people basically made money and spent it, had a good time. And having a good time in the early 19th century, above all, meant dancing. I mean, people danced, and this was part of the Spanish and French tradition of just wall-to-wall dancing, including Sundays, of course.
Dance halls and saloons were crowded with customers. There were traveling circuses and theater groups. New construction changed the face of the city. First, there was the elegant St. Charles Hotel. Then the stately row houses built by Baroness Michaela Elmenester Pontalba. She was one of New Orleans' great benefactors, just like her father had been when Louisiana was a Spanish colony. New Orleans had become the cultural capital of the South and West. And the heart of the city's cultural life was music. Music, more than anything else, erased the divisions of class, race, and ethnicity, and brought New Orleanians together on common ground. Everyone attended the opera, from slaves to slave owners.
Well, you don't want to idealize the era, but there is certainly a lot to recommend it, in that to a degree which we absolutely have lost, culture with a capital C, was something that a surprisingly diverse part of the population participated in.
A man sang an uncouth song to the dancing, which I suppose was in some African language, for it was not French. Never have I seen anything more brutally savage.
Since colonial times, Congo Square had been an open market where slaves were allowed to sell their own produce and merchandise on their day off. But it also became a place where the slaves could openly play African music. Traditional dances like the bambula, the kalinda, and the chica helped these African Americans to preserve an important part of their heritage. The rhythms of Congo Square also became a key ingredient in the rich musical gumbo of New Orleans, the city which gave America its first great composer.
Louis Moreau Gottschalk, born in 1829, died in 1869. He's one of those people like Mozart and Chopin, great genius who died young. He's arguably the greatest musician that New Orleans produced, or America produced, in the 19th century.
New Orleans also attracted artists like John James Audubon, remembered for capturing Louisiana's natural beauty. Marie Adrienne Persac illustrated the state's man-made wonders. New Orleans, and indeed all of Louisiana, had become the engine that drove the economy of the South. This engine was powered by steam. The first steamboat to navigate the Mississippi arrived in New Orleans in 1811. By 1850, more than 3,000 steamboats were docking there each year.
The magnificent floating palaces of steamers frequently look like moving mountains of light and flame. So brilliantly are these enormous river leviathans illuminated, outside and inside.
New Orleans wasn't the only city to prosper from the great paddle wheelers. Using specially outfitted steamboats, it took Captain Henry Miller Shreve 5 years to clear the Red River Raft, a log jam that stretched from Arkansas to Alexandria, choking the Red River for nearly 200 miles. Once he opened the river, commerce boomed in North Louisiana and Texas, making Shreveport the most important city in the region. With new economic opportunities opening there, Anglo-Americans began to pour into the hill country of North Louisiana.
I am very well satisfied with my land. It is, beyond all doubt, the prettiest section of the world I ever saw. The woods look like a meadow, grass a foot high.
This frontier was once unbroken Indian territory. Now only the remnants of a few scattered tribes remained, struggling to survive. For a while at least, Louisiana's Indians would seem to have become an invisible people, eclipsed by a nation of newcomers. As more and more Anglo-American pioneers moved in, the land was transformed. Corn patches became cotton fields, and crude log cabins were soon replaced by stately plantation homes. North Louisiana came to look a lot like the rest of the South.
North Louisiana has developed differently than South Louisiana because North Louisiana was much more of a frontier at the time of incorporation into the Union.
New settlers brought other changes to Louisiana. South Louisiana remained largely Catholic, just as it had been since colonial times. But to the north, came waves of American Protestant congregations, led by ministers like Leonidas Polk, the first Episcopal bishop in the state. He would later die on the battlefield as a Confederate general.
Protestantism is the main form of religion, and the ties to that community, to the southern community, I think are much stronger in northern Louisiana than they are either in the southeast or the southwestern portions of the state.
However different, North and South Louisiana had one thing in common. Both grew rich from the plantation economy. Louisiana produced 1/3 of all the cotton exported by the United States and virtually all the sugar. Following the Mississippi River from Natchez to New Orleans, mansions stretched like a long strand of pearls. But plantation life wasn't all magnolias and mint juleps.
I think it's been glamorized too much. I don't think being a plantation owner was necessarily the happiest, most satisfying life one could have. I think we're misled too often by the structure. The beautiful, well-maintained or restored old plantations have an aura about them, a glamour about them, a history about them, that people look at it and say, oh boy, it must have been wonderful to have lived in those days. I don't think it was so wonderful. I really don't. They left a rich legacy of architecture, but also were major players in America's greatest ugliness, and that's slavery.
The slaves are seated on benches arranged like an amphitheater. In order to give them a better appearance, the merchants keep them quite clean when they are exhibited to the buyers. The latter come and choose the slaves who will fill their needs.
By 1850, New Orleans was the nation's largest slave trading center, with some 300 dealers. The Masonic Temple, the St. Louis Hotel, the Exchange at Esplanade Avenue, all regularly auctioned human beings like livestock. Within a half-mile of the St. Charles Hotel alone, there were 25 slave depots. The slave markets were often the scene of unspeakable human misery.
Never have I seen such an exhibition of intense, unmeasured, and unbounded grief as when Eliza was parted from her child. Oh, how piteously then did she beseech and beg and pray that they might not be separated. Why could they not be purchased together?
If you were sold in New Orleans, the chances that you would stay here were not very, very good. So slaves in Kentucky, Missouri, along the Mississippi River dreaded the prospect of being sold to New Orleans. The dread that you're going to be sold a long, long ways from your loved ones with no chance that you can ever get back. And that basically what it meant, being sold down the road to New Orleans.
Even from within the walls of their grand mansions, some slave owners couldn't hide from the horrors that had made them rich.
I am a slaveholder myself, yet you must not think that I approve of that inhumane commerce. No, I assure you there is no man on earth that can see it in a more horrid light than myself.
Slavery barbarized the whole society. Slaveholders were brutal in their treatment toward slaves. Blacks were brutal in their relationship toward each other. Whites were brutal toward each other. You got used to seeing people mistreated, and it didn't affect you as much as people would have seen it for the first time from the outside.
Slavery is based within violence. Slavery doesn't work without violence. It doesn't work without slaves being kept in their place by having their lives threatened, their children threatened, their relations between husbands and wives, mothers and children being severed.
America had long been haunted by the specter of slavery. Finding excuses for it was getting harder. By the middle of the 19th century, the political compromises and concessions that had held the country together were strained to the limit. the differences between the northern and southern states were rooted in deep cultural and political differences. But in the end, what mattered most was money.
The slave owners were never better off. The price of slaves increased by 70% between 1850 and 1860, which is an indication of what was happening to the profits from owning slaves.
Without the institution of slavery, the great staple products of the South would cease to be grown, and the immense annual results, which are distributed among every class of the community, would cease.
One thing I think it's important to realize is how much money people had tied up in slave capital. Throughout the South, it was about $5 billion, but if you talk about an individual, for example, a prime slave, say, male age 25, worth, say, $1,500 in 1850 or 1855, this would translate to about $35,000 today. So a person owning even one slave, this was a large investment, but a person owning 100 on a plantation or a large number of slaves, this was a tremendous capital investment, even worth more than the land that supported them. The land was not as expensive as the slaves themselves. No one has ever given up that much money without some kind of a fight.
In Louisiana, that fight began the day Abraham Lincoln was elected president.
The Southerners were saying, we used to control the House with respect to the issue of slavery. Now we have an anti-slavery party in control of the House. They had an anti-slavery president. And they were sort of saying, all we've got to defend us now is the Senate. And how long will that last? So they felt they saw creeping advances by a hostile political coalition that would show them no mercy. And that's why they decided to get out while the getting is good.
The Southern people think the result of the election is a sort of declaration of hostility by the North. Nearly every day, Lincoln's effigy is hanged in the principal streets and squares. Secession is openly talked of, apparently with increasing confidence in its success.
The Southern leaders were not fearful. They had become arrogant. We are the great economy. Who are you people with your whole system falling apart to tell us what we can't do?
Have our northern people disregarded the Constitution? We are determined to be an independent people out of the old Union. If we cannot be equals in it, give us our rights.
Everyone recognized the gathering storm on the horizon. Senator Judah Benjamin offered his farewell speech to the United States Senate and then returned home to Louisiana to prepare for what was to come.
And now, senators, within a few weeks we part to meet as senators in one common council chamber of the nation no more forever. Whatever the fate of this horrible contest, no man can tell. But this much I will say, you may carry desolation into our peaceful land, and with torch and fire you may set our cities aflame, but you can never subjugate us. Never.
In January 1861, a convention of Louisiana's leaders met at the state capitol in Baton Rouge. They voted 113 to 17 for secession. The news was announced to a cheering crowd outside. For almost 50 years, Louisiana had been one of the United States. Now she had torn herself from that union. But at a cost her people could not yet conceive. To learn more about Louisiana's rich history, visit us online at louisianahistory.org.
Major funding for the series, Louisiana, A History, was provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and the State of Louisiana. Corporate funding was provided by Bank One, proud to celebrate Louisiana's diverse past and committed to investing in our state's future. Community Coffee, part of Louisiana's rich history. Since 1919, devoted to providing signature coffees to our communities. Additional funding was provided by the following history patrons, helping all citizens discover the extraordinary legacy of Louisiana and its people. To order a VHS or DVD set of the series, Louisiana, A History, or the companion book, Louisiana, An Illustrated History, call 1-800-973-7246 or write to the address on your screen.